Sometimes life erases the pages of the past to give us a chance to write a new chapter, free from old mistakes and fears. The main thing is to dare to take the first step toward those who are ready to create new memories together. Before starting, like and subscribe, it's very important to me. Every evening he remembered the secrets they once shared. But to her, he was nothing more than a stranger. Could a feeling conquer the emptiness of memory and offer a new chance? The city greeted James with a cold wind and damp air. Autumn had nearly given way to winter, leaving behind fragile golden leaves pressed into the wet asphalt. He walked along a familiar street, and every corner, every building stirred a warm nostalgia within him. This was where he had spent his childhood. Here he knew every crack in the pavement, every bench in the park where he and Haley had once sat for long evenings, talking about dreams far removed from reality. Haley. Her name surfaced in his mind naturally, effortlessly, as something inseparable. She had always been a part of this city for him. Like the sound of footsteps through dry leaves, the evening glow of street lamps, or the smell of rain. He remembered how they used to sit on the roof of an old abandoned house, laughing at other people's jokes and swearing they would never forget each other. Back then they believed time would last forever, that nothing would change. But everything had changed. James knew that coming back here meant risking the opening of Pandora's box. Old memories might be warm, but dark shadows lurked behind them. Shadows he preferred not to recall. Yet here he was all the same, because something deep within had pulled him back, compelling him to search for traces of the past where perhaps nothing remained. He glanced around at the old buildings, which seemed hardly touched by time. There was the corner cafe where he and Haley had loved to drink hot chocolate in winter. There was the bookstore they used to visit after school, dreaming they would one day write a story of their own. Everything felt so familiar, yet strangely different. The city was the same, but it felt different, like a place that had once been full of his memories, and now contained only their shadows. James stopped by a bus stop, the very one where they used to say goodbye after long walks. His heart pounded, though he couldn't explain what had drawn him here. He had simply wandered without any particular route in mind until he ended up at this spot. Was it just a coincidence? Or had his memories guided him here subconsciously? He didn't know. But standing there now, he felt a strange unease. The stop looked ordinary, yet something within him resisted the idea of simply leaving. Maybe it was just a memory, or maybe a premonition. Slowly the bus pulled up, its brakes squealing as it sliced through the silence. The doors opened and passengers began to step out. James watched the crowd, uncertain of what he was hoping to see. A sign, some twist of fate that would set everything right. And then he saw her. Haley. Her chestnut hair was a bit shorter than he remembered, but otherwise she looked almost the same. James felt something inside him tremble. He had pictured this meeting so many times over the years, imagining what he would say and how she would react. But the moment their eyes met, the world seemed to stand still. She looked at him, and did not recognize him. There was no flash of memory in her gaze, no surprise, not even the faintest hint of realization. Only a polite, barely perceptible smile meant for a passing stranger. James felt something inside him collapse. "Haley," he breathed, not fully aware whether he had spoken aloud. She paused, studying him a bit more closely as if trying to recall something. But then she turned away. James took a step forward, but all words failed him. He had prepared for this meeting, yet now everything he'd planned to say felt pointless. "Excuse me, do we know each other?" she finally asked, her brow knitting slightly. Her voice was just as he remembered it, warm, gentle, but there wasn't a trace of recognition in it. James felt the cold from the street seep into his chest. She didn't remember him. "It's me, James," he said quietly, hoping for even the slightest flicker of emotion in her eyes. But Haley only shook her head, offering a regretful smile. "I'm sorry. I don't know you." They were the worst words he could have heard. She took a step back, then another, moving away on instinct. The bus started off again, carrying with it the flow of people. James remained where he was, watching as Haley disappeared into the crowd. He felt that in just a few short moments he had lost something essential. Or maybe he had lost it long ago without realizing it. But he couldn't just walk away. He couldn't leave it at that. She might have forgotten him, but he hadn't forgotten her. And now he was determined to find out why. James walked down the street, oblivious to the passers-by, his thoughts far away. His encounter with Haley had thrown him off balance, leaving behind a strange sense of emptiness inside. He had tried to find something familiar in her eyes, but found nothing. The cool evening air stung his face. Memories overwhelmed him. He pictured her in the park, heard her laughter, felt the warmth of a bond they once believed unbreakable. How could she have forgotten all of that? Unable to remain indifferent, James stopped at an intersection, trying to decide where to go next. The silhouette of a cafe came into view, a place where they had once spent evenings talking. He hadn't been there in years, but something inside him hinted that if any trace of an answer existed, it might be there. Summoning his resolve, he crossed the road and went in. The warm aroma of coffee, a faint scent of cinnamon, and the soft glow of old lamps created a cozy atmosphere. But instead of the usual comfort, a sudden realization washed over him. Everything here seemed the same, only Haley was somehow different, or simply not the girl he remembered. Ordering a cappuccino, James sat by the window, from where he used to watch the sparse evening foot traffic and the glow of storefronts. Back in their school days, he and Haley would sit here, arguing about books and movies, dreaming of traveling and writing about their adventures. Now his once vivid, comforting memories felt like a hollow illusion, if Haley remembered none of it. Is it all in the past? Flickered through his mind, yet he couldn't accept it. His soul ached, while his heart spurred him on. Find out. Figure out why she forgot. Help her get her memories back. Finishing his coffee, and trying to mask his confusion with a calm expression, he left the cafe. A wave of dampness hit him as he stepped outside, and his breath turned to white vapor in the cold air. Wandering through dark streets, he thought about the people who might know what had happened to Haley. He remembered Sarah, a mutual friend, always up for any adventure, with a remarkable knack for knowing everything going on in town. But James had lost all his contacts. He no longer had Sarah's number. He needed to rebuild that connection somehow. Perhaps she knew why Haley didn't recognize him. That would put all the pieces back in place. Or at least give him a chance to understand what had happened. Before he knew it, he found himself in front of the familiar building where Haley used to live. The paint was peeling on the entrance walls, and a dim light glowed in the windows. He recalled how he would walk her to this very doorstep in the evenings, how they laughed and promised each other their friendship was forever. But times change. She might not even live there anymore. James couldn't bring himself to press the doorbell, worried he would disturb strangers. Several times, his hand hovered over the button, only to drop away again, a painful sense of helplessness gripping him. At last, mustering his will, he turned around and left. His heart ached, as if with each step he lost another thread leading him to answers. Only one thought remained. Unless he found a way to contact someone from Haley's past, she would remain a stranger. And once, they had been each other's whole world. Wet leaves crunched softly underfoot, and James felt as if he were wandering through a maze of memories. Still, he knew what he had to do. Tomorrow he would try to find Sarah, on social media, through mutual friends in some old school lists. Find her, in order to discover what had happened to Haley. Only then could he decide how to help her remember, or at least figure out how to live with this new reality. Evening gave way to late night, street lamps illuminating empty roads as James made his way back to the temporary hotel where he was staying. His first encounter with this changed Haley left him with a lingering sense of grief, but also a renewed determination to act. He had once promised himself he would never forget her, and he had no intention of giving up now, even if she had forgotten him. The night in the hotel was restless. James slept in fitful bursts, waking periodically from nightmares in which he saw Haley looking at him with unfamiliar eyes. Each time he opened his eyes to the darkness, he almost hoped to hear her voice, or at least catch that once familiar scent. But instead, the semi-darkness of the unfamiliar room pressed in on him, and outside, the wind howled desolately. He got up before his alarm, forced himself to take a cool shower, and soon left the hotel. The city had barely woken up. Quiet streets, only a few people here and there, an early morning chill in the air. Holding a cup of hot coffee, James headed toward the old school where he and Haley had once studied. When he saw the building, boarded up for renovations, he was overwhelmed by a mix of nostalgia and unease. Memories of the time he and Haley spent here flooded back, yet the school looked strange and empty, as though it had erased a part of his past. James remembered the basement where he and his friends used to sneak in just for fun and decided to check it out, hoping to find something, anything, that might help him understand what had happened to Haley. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of dust. Weak beams of light pierced through cracks, and as James swept his phone's flashlight across the corners, he stumbled upon a pile of old-school newspapers and archived documents. Flipping through the yellowed pages, he came across a familiar name. Haley. A few articles mentioned her as a talented participant in literary contests. One of them talked about her successes and her plans to move to another city for school, but there was nothing about what happened afterward. He also spotted Sarah's name, their mutual friend, who had once won a local public speaking competition. Realizing there were no more clues to be found, James made his way back outside. A cold but gentle morning breeze enveloped him from head to toe. He headed to a small nearby park to clear his mind and think. Once upon a time, he and Haley often strolled here, discussing their dreams and plans for the future. Now these paths felt unfamiliar, marking his solitude. Sitting on a bench, he tried to figure out why Haley didn't remember him. He had dismissed the idea that she was faking it. Her gaze had been too genuinely blank. Perhaps she really had gone through something serious. But how could he find someone who knew the details? The previous evening, back at the hotel, James had gone through his old contacts and attempted to find Sarah on social media. Unexpectedly, he succeeded. He spotted the familiar red-haired face on one of the profiles. He sent a short message, not expecting a quick reply, but by that morning, he had already received a notification about an incoming call. Now the phone lit up again. An unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. "Hello," James said, trying to suppress his excitement. "Hey, it's Sarah," came a slightly distorted voice. "You messaged me about Haley. I'm in town for a couple of days. We can meet." James's heart skipped a beat. Maybe he would finally learn something concrete about Haley. "Sure," he replied. "Where's good for you? You know the cafe called Lavender Shore on Clark Street?" she asked. "Meet me there in half an hour." After the short beep that ended the call, James stood there for a few more seconds, then resolutely got up from the bench. Half an hour, that was enough time to get to a cafe he had never been to before, yet he already felt drawn to it. There he might find some answers. Sarah looked the same as ever, red hair, expressive eyes, and that easy manner of speaking. Only now her face reflected an adult weariness and experience. They sat down at a table by the window and ordered coffee. At first, the conversation lagged. Both seemed unsure of how to begin. "You said you saw Haley?" she finally asked, deciding to be direct. "Yes, but she looked at me like a stranger. She had no idea who I was," James answered, trying not to reveal how much it hurt. Sarah frowned, worry flashing in her eyes. "I haven't seen her in ages, but I heard she was in a serious accident about 2 years ago. People said she lost a lot of memories. Supposedly, she barely recognized her parents at first." Those words echoed in James's mind. Everything started to fall into place. Haley really might not remember the past. Are you sure?" he asked, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I didn't see it myself, but mutual friends told me. Then Haley moved, changed her number. I think she still has health issues, but I don't know the details," Sarah sighed, sounding sympathetic toward both Haley and James. "I'm sorry, James. I know this must be hard for you." James dropped his gaze to his cup of coffee, which now tasted bitter despite the sugar. It was as if a pit had opened before him. She wasn't pretending. She truly had forgotten everything that once connected them. And that was worse than any other explanation because it seemed impossible to fix. "It's all right," he said hoarsely. "Thank you for telling me. At least now I have some clarity." "Maybe she needs support," Sarah said softly, a note of hope in her voice. If she lost her memories, someone from the past might help her. Although, I'm not sure she's open to anyone. Honestly, I don't even know if she wants to remember. You know? Not sure if she wants to. The thought repeated in James's head. But could you force someone to regain what they can't, or don't want to recall? He thanked Sarah for her time, paid for the coffee, and stepped out into the street feeling as if a heavy weight had settled inside him. While he listened to the muffled hum of the city, a determination grew within him to at least try to be there for Haley. Even if everything they had once shared was gone for her, he needed to know whether there was any chance to help her see that once they had been close, or failing that, to forge a new connection that didn't rely on memories. James's steps quickened, matching his heartbeat. He was afraid, yet he couldn't just do nothing. If Haley had moved, he would have to track down her new address, find out more about her condition, at least make an attempt. It wasn't just about fulfilling some old promise, it was about Haley herself, even if she had changed completely. The wind carried a damp chill and the hint of coming rain, but James barely noticed the cold. He understood that there was a long road of uncertainty ahead, but he finally had a fragment of the truth he had been seeking. Haley might not remember him because of a tragic accident, and if she never remembers, then he'd have to accept it. But he couldn't just give up without trying. A gust of wind stung his face, making him blink and take in his surroundings. He set off along the sidewalk, forming a plan in his head. He hadn't pressed Sarah for Haley's new number. She likely didn't know it anyway. That left only one option, to act on his own. A new feeling was growing inside him. It wouldn't be easy, but he'd do whatever it took to show Haley that she wasn't alone. And if he could, to support her on the path she now faced, even if her memories never returned. That thought stayed with James as he left the bustling street, heading back toward his hotel. He knew the calm before the storm was over. Now Haley's fate, and by extension his own, had set off in a new direction. And though the evening shadows were gathering, a quiet resolve glowed within him. He wouldn't back down until he found a way to be there for her. By evening, a chilly rain had gripped the city, drumming against the window of James's hotel room. Since morning, he had tried to uncover any new details about Haley's life after the accident, but he was no closer to clarity. He kept staring at the piece of paper with her old number, unable to bring himself to dial. What if she doesn't want to talk to me? What if I only make things worse? Doubts buzzed in his mind. When dusk finally conquered the sky, he sat on the edge of the bed and ran a hand over his face. His thoughts swirled in a vortex. Haley had always seemed like an unshakable optimist, convinced that any misfortune could be overcome. But back then, no one knew what a real tragedy was. He pictured her lying in a hospital bed, staring into emptiness without recognizing even those closest to her. How she might have had to relearn how to get up each day, how to speak, how to piece her identity back together. Would it have been any different if he'd been there for her? But he had left, abandoning her when she needed support. Suddenly his phone buzzed, making him jump. It was a short text from Sarah. I found something about Haley. Looks like she has a new address. Call me if you want it. Feeling his heart tighten, he phoned Sarah, and after a bit of hesitation, she recited the new address. It was an old multi-story building on the outskirts of town. According to Sarah, Haley's parents had been out of the country for an extended period, leaving her mostly on her own. James felt a wave of helplessness. What if her life was now set up in such a way that he was no longer needed? But guessing wouldn't get him anywhere. He glanced at the clock, noting it was already late, but he didn't want to wait another day. Stepping over to the window, he watched the rain reflecting the streetlights. I'll at least try calling her, he decided, dialing the familiar number. The phone rang on, each ring like a blow to his heart. Then suddenly someone picked up. James was about to say her name but never got the chance. He heard a faint rustling on the other end, then the line went dead. Maybe the number no longer belonged to Haley, or perhaps she just couldn't bring herself to answer an unknown caller. He spent the night in a restless half-sleep, and by morning the rain had finally stopped. Carrying a takeaway coffee, James headed out to wander the streets, hoping to calm himself. but the memories of her wouldn't let him go. He walked through those familiar alleys where they used to laugh, feeling how absurdly everything had changed. Now she was a stranger in a place that once belonged to them both. Soon, unable to stand the uncertainty any longer, he set off resolutely for the address Sarah had given him. An old building with peeling walls and dim windows. The courtyard was damp, its emptiness vaguely unsettling. James climbed the creaking steps, eyes scanning the apartment numbers on the mailboxes. The one he needed matched the number Sarah had mentioned. He froze in front of the door, unsure whether to ring. What if no one lives here anymore? Or what if she simply doesn't want to see me? But the next moment, he raised his hand and pressed the buzzer. A muted chime echoed in the hallway, each second dragging on. At last, he heard the creak of floorboards, then the click of a bolt. The door opened a few inches, and a pale, middle-aged woman peered through the narrow gap. Definitely not Haley. "Who is it?" she asked warily. James swallowed hard. "Sorry, I'm looking for Haley. Does she live here?" The woman frowned slightly. Her eyes swept over him, as if assessing whether to let him in. "Yes. And who are you?" I'm an old friend," he managed quietly, searching for the right words. "I'd really like to see her, even just for a minute." She closed the door again briefly, perhaps consulting someone, or debating whether this visit might be dangerous. James's mouth went dry, and his heart pounded like a street drum. If Haley really was here, he would soon have his answer, whether she would accept him or reject him forever. At last, the door opened wider, and the woman sighed, motioning for him to come inside. "All right, come in. I'm Sofa. I look after her since the accident. But please don't upset Haley, if you really are a friend." Stepping into the warm hallway, James noticed the worn linoleum, the scent of medication, and a faint lavender air freshener. His chest tightened. It looked like she truly did need constant help and support. And he hadn't known a thing about what had happened to her all this time. "She's in the living room," Sophia said, indicating a partially open door. "Please be gentle with her. It's still hard for her to remember, and some things she just can't recall." James nodded, took a deep breath and crossed the threshold. There on the couch sat Haley, cradling a mug of tea in both hands. She looked fragile, pale, a distant emptiness in her eyes that he had never seen before. At the sight of James, her head lifted, and he saw a flicker of alarm. "Hello," he said softly, lacking any better way to begin. "Do we know each other?" she asked, voicing the question he dreaded most. A tightness seized his chest, but James still managed a faint, sad smile and stepped closer. "We used to," he said, knowing that from here on out, he would have to explain everything from the beginning. She glanced at Sophia, who gave a slight nod encouraging her. Haley's face was marked by such confusion that James felt his heart ache. Yet beneath that confusion, there seemed to be the faintest spark of curiosity, or some distant echo of recognition. And so he stood there under her quiet gaze, feeling the city outside blur into gray outlines, time itself seeming to pause. Here was the moment when past and present converged, offering them both a chance at a new beginning, or a final farewell. James stood at the door, his hand still feeling the cold touch of the metal doorbell. Silence, broken only by faint sounds from the hallway, stretched painfully long. A swarm of feelings churned in his chest. Hope for a renewed encounter, and fear that he was intruding on a fragile reality that wasn't his. He heard cautious footsteps inside, and his heart began to pound faster. When the bolt clicked softly, James drew a sharp breath, bracing himself to see Haley, or whoever was there in her place. But the door opened only a couple of inches, revealing a pale, somewhat confused face. It wasn't Haley. "Good evening," he said gently, though he could barely control his own anxiety. "I'm sorry to bother you. Does Haley live here?" The woman, dressed in a warm vest over her robe, frowned, as though deciding whether to trust this stranger. Several painfully long seconds passed before her brow relaxed slightly, and she nodded. "Yes, she does, but she's having a hard time right now," she said, giving James a watchful yet sympathetic look. "And you are?" That question hit James unpleasantly in the chest. In just a few moments, He needed to explain why he was so eager to see Haley. Should he say he was from the part of her life she had forgotten? Or simply call himself an old friend? "I'm a childhood friend," he answered quietly, lowering his gaze. "We went to school together, but we lost touch. I only recently learned about what happened to her." A flicker of understanding crossed the woman's face. She sighed and opened the door a bit wider. "Come in then. But please, don't push her," she said, gesturing for him to enter. "My name is Sophia. I help her around the house and offer support so she's not all alone." A warm draft of air enveloped James as he stepped inside. The place smelled of medication and a lavender air freshener mingling together. A few children's drawings on the wall and old photographs hinted that within these walls there once lived memories, though apparently not Haley's. "Does she not remember anything?" he finally managed to ask once they had walked a bit further. His voice sounded hollow, revealing the helplessness he had been trying to hide. Sophia shrugged, carefully taking his jacket from him. "Some things she doesn't remember at all. Other things come back to her in bits and pieces," she explained quietly, glancing toward the room where Haley was. "The doctor said some memories might return with time, but sometimes they never do." James felt a tightness in his chest as he realized her memory loss could be permanent. He lowered his head, focusing on the worn linoleum at his feet. "Try talking to her," Sophia added, noticing his state, though her tone remained cautious. "Just be gentle, please." She knocked on the door and opened it a crack, letting James step inside first. Entering the living room, he tried not to imagine the worst. But seeing Haley, pale, fragile, made his heart clench painfully. She sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, looking out the window as she cradled a warm mug in her hands. At the sound of footsteps, she turned her head. "Haley," he breathed. And in that single word lay all the pain of a separation she didn't remember. She studied him for a few seconds, as if trying to identify who he was. Then she spoke, her voice soft and slightly husky. "Do we know each other?" That question struck James harder than he had expected. He had pictured this moment countless times, but reality was much more painful. Slowly taking a seat on a stool opposite her, he summoned every bit of willpower he had. "Once, yes," he said quietly. "We were very close. I moved away, and you?" He trailed off, not wanting to launch straight into the details of her tragedy. "I found out about your accident." "Accident?" she repeated, her gaze dropping back to her mug as her fingers clutched the edge of the blanket. "You know, I hardly remember anything from before." The bitterness in her words felt familiar to James, reflecting his own fears. He realized that every additional detail might cause her pain. "I don't want to push you," he said as gently as he could. "But I couldn't stay away. I had to see you." Haley lowered her eyes, and he could see the helplessness and confusion on her face. It seemed she was trying to grasp what might have connected her to this man she couldn't recognize. Yet there was also a faint spark of curiosity in her gaze, as though something inside her sensed he wasn't a complete stranger. From the sidelines, Sophia gave a slight nod, signaling that it was enough for one day. James understood her unspoken message and decided not to push any further. But before he stood up, he gathered his courage. "I'll be in town for a while. If it's all right, I'd like to visit you sometimes. I just want to be here, even if you never remember me." His words were quiet, but his resolve was unshakable. Haley hesitated, her gaze clouding momentarily, until she gave a barely perceptible nod. "I don't mind," she answered in almost a whisper. "Maybe one day I'll figure it out. Or at least get used to you." James's heart trembled. It was only the slightest ray of hope, but it was enough for him. He nodded to Sophia, indicating he would go. As he returned to the hallway, he heard Haley exhale softly, as though relieved of a heavy weight. Likely even this short conversation had been exhausting for her. "Thank you for letting me in," he told Sophia when she opened the front door. "I won't rush her." "I hope not," she replied. "If it makes her worse, I'll have to ask you to leave." James understood. This woman stood guard over Haley's peace of mind and was ready to protect her from any distress. He didn't blame Sophia. He himself feared causing harm. When the door closed behind him, and he found himself back in the hallway. It felt as if a gentle breeze of freedom brushed his face. He had seen her, spoken to her at last. Even if she didn't remember him, he wasn't giving up. Outside, the air smelled of damp leaves, and the sparse stars twinkled through ragged clouds. James walked along the sidewalk, pulling his jacket around him, his heart pounding in time with his steps. Though the first meeting had been painful, it offered a fragile hope. She hadn't turned him away, hadn't told him never to come back. "I can't promise I'll ever remember you, but come again." Those words echoed in his mind, warming him more than any hot tea. Perhaps what truly bound them was not memory, but something subtler. Something that still lived within her even if her memories were gone. And James was ready to fight for that something, even if it meant feeling his way forward in the dark. Almost a week had passed since their first awkward meeting at Haley's doorstep. During that time, James had visited her more than once, cautiously, as though afraid of startling her fragile willingness to socialize. He always called ahead, asking if his visit would be a bother, and only then climbed those same creaking steps. Each time he saw Haley, something within him clenched at the tender mix of familiar features and her new, barely perceptible outlook on life. She could smile and discuss everyday things with him, yet it was clear that part of her soul remained closed off, guarded. Maybe she was afraid he'd expect her to recall what she couldn't remember. But James showed her that he accepted her new reality without pressing for answers. One afternoon when he dropped by, he found Haley trying to bake cookies. There was flour everywhere, her cookbook was open in the middle, and a bowl of loose dough stood on the table. Haley was wearing a funny apron, with faint smudges of dough on her cheek. When she saw James, she blushed. "Oh, I really wasn't expecting company right in the middle of my culinary experiments," she mumbled, almost dropping her spoon. "Sorry I didn't warn you," he replied with a smile. "I can help if you like." She nodded, and together they tried to figure out how much more sugar and spices to add. James suggested using cinnamon, and Haley hesitated. "Do I like cinnamon?" she asked, as if hoping to learn something about her past. "You've always liked spicy aromas," he explained gently, without going into detail that might upset her. And so, step by step, they created a new memory, perhaps without the easy familiarity of old times, but still genuinely theirs. When the cookies were done, a warm aroma filled the apartment, and Haley, taking the tray out of the oven, beamed with almost childlike joy. "They turned out great," she exclaimed. "You know, I often get confused about recipes and forget what I've already tried. But with you here I managed." James felt a pleasant thrill at the trusting tone in her voice. After pouring tea into mugs, they settled in the living room to sample the fruit of their efforts. Sophia had gone out on an errand, so the house was peacefully quiet. "Tell me about yourself," Haley suggested, taking a sip of tea. "I know we used to be friends and that you left. But what happened after that?" For a moment he hesitated. He had once waited for a chance to explain why he'd left town and talk about the mistakes he'd made. But now he realized he didn't want to burden her with too much of the past. "After school, I left to study in another city," he said, keeping it relatively neutral. "Worked a bit in an office, then switched to freelancing. Over time I realized I was missing a sense of home. So I came back to figure myself out, and also to find out how you were doing." Haley nodded, dropping her gaze to the plate of cookies. "I'm sorry if I let you down," she said quietly, her words startlingly direct. "You probably hoped I'd recognize you." A note of guilt in her voice tugged painfully at James's heart. He reached out, gently touching her hand. "I don't have those expectations," he replied. "I just wanted to know you were okay. And if I'm lucky enough to become part of your life again, even starting from scratch, I'd be happy." She gave a small smile, gratitude flickering in her eyes. "Starting from scratch," she repeated. "I like that. Everything from before the accident is so hazy and sometimes even frightening. I'm glad you're not trying to force me to remember. I believe that memories aren't the only thing connecting people," he said, looking intently at her face. "We can create new ones." As if to confirm his words, the old space heater in the corner suddenly gurgled loudly, and they both burst into laughter, the awkwardness between them dissolving. Their laughter rang out naturally, almost like two old friends who had spent years joking about such trivial things. But for Haley, everything felt new, and for James it was a precious gift, a chance to feel her presence once more. They spent the rest of the day discussing trivial matters, tasty recipes, the weather, and some unusual videos Haley had recently seen online. She asked for his opinion, and James, delighted by her interest, answered eagerly. With every laugh and every brief remark filled with warmth, a bridge formed between them. Not one leading back to old memories, but a new one, built on care and shared moments in the here and now. Later, when evening began to wrap itself around the city, James decided it was time to go, not wanting to overwhelm Haley. She walked him to the hallway, and he felt a strange familiar flutter inside, like saying goodbye to someone very dear, despite the fact that they were, in some sense, only just getting acquainted. "Thank you for today," she said, hugging herself as if she felt a slight chill. "I haven't felt this comfortable around someone for a long time." "I'm glad I could help," he answered. "And if you ever want to try making another batch of buns or cookies, give me a call. I'll happily be your backup." She smiled a little shyly and nodded. Stepping out onto the street, James realized with some surprise that he no longer felt weighed down by Haley's lack of old memories. He could see how she was cautiously moving closer to him, letting him into her life. And that was enough to warm his heart. A light drizzle fell as early twilight draped itself across the sky, the street lamps making the raindrops shimmer like tiny sparks. Pulling up his jacket collar, James headed down the sidewalk, smiling to himself. He and Haley weren't simply meeting again. They were starting to piece together new and happy moments, ones that might prove far more important than the fading memories of what once was. Another week had gone by since Haley and James decided to stop trying to force her old memories to return, and instead focus on building something new. During that time, they spent several evenings together, cooking dinner, browsing the neighborhood bookstore, and once even venturing out to a small park. It wasn't anything grand, but each shared moment felt important. One afternoon, James dropped by without warning and found Haley passionately trying to bake cinnamon rolls. A warm, spicy aroma filled the kitchen, and Haley, flushed from the heat, was taking another tray out of the oven. Watching her concentrate and delight in her own success, James couldn't help but smile. "Sorry for the mess," she said shyly, brushing flour off her hands. "I'm experimenting with dough and spices. Sometimes I forget which step I'm on, but I'm trying to keep notes." "This is great," he said admiringly as he stepped into the kitchen. "I can already tell from the smell that your experiment's a success." Haley nodded, placing the rolls on a plate and inviting James to taste them. At the first bite they agreed, a slightly crispy crust, a soft center, and a vibrant cinnamon aroma. Haley laughed when he praised her culinary boldness. "For some reason, I like adding a lot of cinnamon," she confessed. "I can't remember if I used to love it, but now it just feels right." Her words reminded James that many small details, tastes, preferences, habits, might once have been familiar to her, but her memory no longer held them. He smiled, gently touching her hand. "I think you should trust your instincts rather than old recipes," he said. "If your heart says add extra cinnamon, then that's what you should do." Haley laughed and sat down across from him, inviting him to have a cup of tea. In moments like this, she looked calm and cheerful, as if all her fears and burdens were behind her. But James knew she sometimes felt anxious, aware that she couldn't remember her old self. "You know," Haley said, taking a sip of tea, "at first I thought I had to regain my past at any cost, to figure out who I was. But now, I realize you don't have to know everything to be happy. We're making new memories, maybe that's enough." Her voice sounded genuine, with a faint trace of relief. James nodded, feeling a gentle warmth spread through his chest. He loved that she wasn't afraid to say these things openly, admitting the past might not come back, but still choosing to live in the now. "You're right," he replied, smiling. "Sometimes new memories can be more important than old ones. In the end, it's all about how we create them." Setting down her cup, Haley suggested they go for a short walk before night fell. Sophia, busy with her own matters, now left them alone without worrying that James might pressure Haley about her memories. It seemed she understood he had accepted Haley's new reality. They stepped outside, immersed in the cool autumn air. Slanted evening sunlight glinted off the damp asphalt, and a breeze played with the remaining yellow leaves in the trees. They didn't need to hunt for special topics to discuss. Everything flowed naturally. "They say there's a new sculpture in the little park around the corner," James said. "Want to go see it?" Haley agreed, and they strolled in that direction. On the way, she shared her latest little victories. How she'd learned to paint with watercolors, and how she took care of a houseplant on the windowsill, despite sometimes forgetting when to water it. James listened intently, moved by how she found joy in simple things. When they reached the park, sure enough, they noticed a new sculpture along the main walkway. An abstract piece, beads of water still dripping from the recent rain. Haley stopped and squinted at it, examining the shape. "It's unclear what it's supposed to mean, isn't it?" she said, furrowing her brow. "Everyone sees something different. For some reason, I see something about time, about how we change while everything around us keeps flowing." James shrugged, smiling at her insight. "Maybe you're right. Art often reflects what we feel inside. You paint with watercolors according to your feelings, not some rule book." Haley glanced at him from under her brow. In that look, there was a closeness that needed no explanation. She liked that he saw her not as the girl who lost her memories, but as a person still discovering herself in the present. They wandered through the park a bit more, choosing a quieter path and settling on a bench that overlooked a pond. The water rippled in the breeze and dark clouds drifted overhead, hinting at an early twilight. "You know," Haley said softly, gazing at the water, "I used to be afraid someone would show up and say, 'Remember, you have to remember who you were.' I felt like I wouldn't be able to meet their expectations." James understood. People from the past often unconsciously demand a return to old habits and emotions, and he knew how much that weighed on her. "I don't want to force you to be anyone other than who you are now," he said quietly. "If something comes back to you, let it happen naturally. If not, well, it's not the end of the world. You're still you, and that's who I want to know." Haley said nothing, but tears glimmered briefly in her eyes. She blinked and gave him a faint smile. "Thank you. It's nice that I can just be myself, without carrying someone else's expectations." A gust of wind tore a few leaves from a tree, swirling them between the bench and the pond. Haley pulled her scarf tighter, and James inched closer in case she needed warmth. In that moment, they felt a quiet understanding forming between them. They were connected, not by their old experiences but by something more immediate, and that something was more precious than many memories. Later, on their way back, Haley suggested they stop by her place for cinnamon tea and the leftover rolls. James readily agreed, unable to hide his smile. That evening, they sat in the living room again, laughing at random cat photos online and chatting about plans for the next day. Haley mentioned wanting to try a new watercolor technique, and James realized she was someone moving forward, unburdened by the memories she'd lost. He was part of that forward motion, a friend who accepted her as she was. Though James still felt a subtle pang of regret that she didn't remember the old moments they'd once shared. That feeling no longer weighed him down. On the contrary, he sensed those missing pages could be replaced by a new story. Maybe bolder, kinder, and more pure. And each day they spent together proved that sometimes what matters most isn't getting back memories, but learning to create new ones together. Several more weeks passed. Late autumn gradually gave way to winter. The city sank into a penetrating chill, and the tree outside Haley and Sophia's apartment window had almost completely lost its leaves. But within Haley herself, a quiet spring was blossoming. Her heart was thawing, finding new warmth in James's presence. That evening, when he came by once again, she looked focused and a little anxious. On the table lay a small parcel wrapped with a thin ribbon, which Haley turned over in her hands, seeming unsure whether to give it to James. "This is for you," she said softly when she noticed him enter, her voice quiet but resolute. "I learned to paint a bit from scratch without remembering what I might have known before, and I decided to make a small gift." James felt a pleasant sense of anticipation rise within him. Carefully, he took the parcel from her hands and unwrapped it. Beneath the ribbon was a piece of thick paper, with a simple yet moving watercolor. It depicted an old street lamp and a bench surrounded by autumn leaves, and in the distance were faint silhouettes of two people. "That's our park," he whispered, smiling. He instantly recognized the spot where, not long ago, they'd drunk tea from a thermos and talked about the future. "It's beautiful. I tried to convey that this isn't the past but our present, the way I see it," Haley admitted, noticeably embarrassed. "Maybe I don't remember how it looked to you before, but now it's special to me too." James gazed at the painting, overwhelmed with gratitude and tenderness. He slowly sat down on the couch beside her, trying to find the right words, though all he could think about was how happy he felt. "You have no idea what this means to me," he finally said, holding her hand in his. "Thank you. It's the best gift I could have hoped for." They sat quietly for a while, until Haley changed the subject and suggested they go for a walk. It was already getting dark outside, and the air had a sharp chill, heralding the arrival of winter. Haley wrapped a scarf around her neck, and together they stepped out into the softly flickering lamplight, leaving the warmth of the apartment behind. "Lately, I've started to feel like I actually have a future," she said quietly as they made their way through a deserted square. The long shadows of the trees enveloped the path, where only an occasional beam from the street lamps filtered through. "Before, I was afraid of thinking about tomorrow, afraid it would just remind me of how little I know about myself. But now, I want to do new things, take music lessons, learn to bake something besides cinnamon buns." James nodded, glad to hear it. "That's great. I'd be happy to help if you want," he offered, trying not to sound pushy. "If not, well, I'll just be here for you." Haley's gaze grew more assured as she turned to him. "You've already done so much for me. I used to see you only as the reminder of who I used to be. But now, I see someone." She paused, as if searching for the right words. "Someone I want to share happiness with. Right now, not in the past." Gently, James placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling a warm tremor course through him from his fingertips to his heart. They continued walking, step by step, nearing the very spot Haley had depicted in her painting. The autumn leaves were now damp and clung to their shoes, the icy wind urging them to walk faster. But inside them both, a quiet light glowed. When they reached the bench, Haley suddenly stopped and looked around, as if searching the darkness for something. "I think I've been here with you before, haven't I?" she asked, smiling. "Not too long ago," James confirmed, remembering how they'd sat beneath that street lamp with a warm thermos, talking about what she wanted to learn next. "So this is one of our shared memories," she said, sitting down on the bench. "No old baggage, but genuine." They settled beside each other, and James pulled a small thermos from his backpack, as though he had foreseen the need for something warm. Steam rose when he poured tea into the lid. "Do you want cinnamon or plain?" he asked with a grin. "Cinnamon, of course," she replied, scooting closer so his jacket would shield her from the wind. A cozy warmth shone through even in that small gesture. James felt a growing certainty that everything had been worth it. He recalled how, in the beginning, he was terrified she'd never remember him, how he'd clung to the past. But now he understood. What truly mattered was the genuine bond they'd created, one that didn't rely on erased fragments. "You know," Haley said, taking a sip, "I used to think I had to find all the lost pieces of my memory to figure out who I was. But now," she looked up at the sky where stars just barely peeked through the clouds, "now I feel I can be myself even without them." James felt relief wash over him, as though the last weight of guilt for not being able to restore her past was lifted. They simply sat there, gazing at the cool November sky, a quiet happiness welling up inside each of them at the thought that these moments were exactly what made their lives meaningful. A sudden gust of wind brought the first few snowflakes, making Haley flinch and laugh as the flakes landed unexpectedly on her face. James caught one on his palm before it melted and showed it to her. "Look, it's almost perfect," he said. "Like everything that comes at just the right moment," she replied, smiling again. They edged closer together and James, hesitating only briefly, put his arm around her to shield her from the cold of the night. She didn't pull away. Instead, she breathed out softly, as though acknowledging that with him by her side, neither snow nor lost memories could scare her. "Thank you for not leaving me alone," she whispered. "Thank you for letting me stay," James answered. In that moment, there was no need to talk about the past that remained lost to Haley's memory. They both felt a unique warmth binding them in the here and now, and that was enough to envision a bright future. Haley might never remember who she was before the accident, but she was certain of who she was now and of how dear the people were who accepted her new self, rather than the person she'd once been. "Maybe we should go back and bake some rolls?" James suggested quietly. "I've got an idea for a glaze we haven't tried yet." "Great idea," Haley agreed. "Tell me about it on the way." They stood up from the bench, still shivering from the cold, and headed down the empty lane. The soft light of the street lamp stayed behind, illuminating their silhouettes while snowflakes continued to fall, adding to the fairy tale-like feeling of the moment. But most important, with every step, every glance, they felt that their story was still unfolding. Not in some distant, forgotten past, but in the present. And as the city lights flickered in the distance, Haley and James, warmed by each other's presence, walked homeward, where the cozy scent of cinnamon and the promise of new shared memories awaited. Subscribe to the channel and hit the like button, so you don't miss more heartwarming stories.